This is Pastor Phil with this week's Faith Time video. I want to remind you that it's this upcoming Sunday after our second service that we're going to have the in-person portion of this educational opportunity. We're going to get together, share a meal, and talk about our theme for this month, which has been What Did Jesus Do? If you're planning to attend that, please do let us know so we can buy enough food. You can do that by email or call me on my cell, text me, call the church office, anything that works for you. And we look forward to seeing you. I think it's going to be a great time of fellowship and learning. I'm really looking forward to it. Please do join us. So we have been talking about what did Jesus do. So we've talked about miracles of healing, casting out demons or exorcism, teaching. We looked at the Sermon on the Mount for that. Miracles of abundance, like the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. Miracles of authority over nature, like the stilling of the storm and the walking on water. All those are great categories to think about the different kinds of things that Jesus did to help us understand a little bit of where he was coming from. But today, we're going to talk about really the culmination or the central biggest part of what Jesus did for us, and that is the cross and resurrection. One of the words that the church uses to help describe what happens in the cross and resurrection is the word atonement. And you can kind of look at the word atonement and figure out what it means. It's spelled out at-one-ment. So the atonement brings together, makes one, something that was separate before. And what's coming together that was separate in the cross and resurrection is God and humankind. Why was God and humankind separated? Because of humankind's sin. Sin is just a word that means turning away from God and God's will. We see it happening in the very beginning in the book of Genesis. The first man and woman, Adam and Eve, begin this habit of sin, of turning away from God when they break God's rules and don't follow God's will. And we see in the world today, sin still happens, where anytime there's violence, anytime there's people who are not sharing with folks who need something, that's all against God's will. So sin is still part of the problem that humankind has. So how does the cross and resurrection have anything to do with that? Well, one of the ideas that's sort of helpful to understand what difference it makes is the idea of sacrifice. Now, a sacrifice is when you give up something to make up for something. So in the Old Testament, when a person was guilty of a sin, was guilty of not following God's will, they may have taken a perfect animal from their herds, like a perfect lamb or something like that, and they would give it up, sacrifice it to make up for their sin. So what happens in the cross and resurrection is Jesus offers himself as the one perfect sacrifice for all of humankind, for all of time. What made Jesus the perfect sacrifice was that he was without sin. The church teaches that Jesus was the only person who has never sinned. Now, all of us have fallen short, make mistakes in other ways, but Jesus never did that, and so that's why he is the perfect sacrifice. And what's important about that, too, is that it's God making the sacrifice, not us. God sacrifices his Son to make up for our sin. That's why we call it the good news. It's sad that Jesus had to die. We don't, when we celebrate Good Friday, we don't do it as a happy time, but as a time of mourning for Jesus' death. But we also call it Good Friday, and it's good because it's God making up for our sins by sending his Son to die for us. And I know that's a little confusing sounding, and there's lots more to say about it, lots more to think about it. But really, all we really need to know is that when we look to the cross of Jesus, when we hear the story of him giving himself up, it's all about God's love for us and God's willingness to do whatever it takes to make sure that we are with him, that we are within God's family. So the cross and resurrection is the central part of what Jesus does. We can read about it in all four Gospels, so I invite you to do that. And it's neat to look at that story and compare them to one another. We might do a little bit of that on Sunday. And that story is sort of the central message of the Christian church, because after Jesus is raised from the dead, he sends out his disciples to tell the story about what he did, about all his healings, exorcisms, his miracles, and about his death and resurrection. And that really becomes the central message of the Christian church, that this Jesus was sent by God. He made a sacrifice for our sins, and in his name we are forgiven of all our sins. and that we're called to gather together every week on early in the morning on the first day of the week, Sunday, which was when he was found to be raised from the dead, to celebrate him and to celebrate God's love and God's goodness. And that really is a good definition of the church in a nutshell. So I hope to see you on Sunday, where we'll talk about all these things and have a time to share what some of these things mean for us in our personal walk of faith. And thank you for listening. We'll see you on Sunday.